As we saw in the earlier part of this lecture, Europe was under siege from the Muslim Empire. But it wasn't the only enemies that Christian Europe was having to face. They were also having to deal with a group called the Vikings. The Vikings were people from Scandinavia. Scandinavia is an area made up of modern-day Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland. The Vikings themselves were fantastic seafarers, tradespeople, and warriors. With regards to their seafaring capabilities, the Vikings were specialized in sacking European cities. They would essentially attack European cities, grab what other loot and gold they could find, sometimes slaves, and then return home. Their ships were well adept on sailing on open water as they were going down the numerous rivers that made up Europe. An important part about the geography of Europe is that rivers were some of the main trade routes throughout Europe. And so a lot of cities, like Paris, for example, and London as well, are built right next to rivers. So the Vikings themselves would sail down from Scandinavia, go into the river sources, and attack cities, and then return home. Now, sometimes the Vikings didn't leave. In fact, the Vikings weren't just looking for loot and gold. They were looking for areas to settle as well. And the Vikings did settle in areas such as Russia, where they were called the Rus, but they also settled in areas in England, called the Danelaw, and even in northern France. So it wasn't simply a smash and grab operation for some of the Vikings. They actually set up long-term settlements in some of these areas. The Vikings were also extremely skilled craftsmen and tradespeople. There's historical evidence showing that the Vikings had made their way all the way down to Constantinople, set up trade routes in between Scandinavia and Constantinople, and trade routes in between Scandinavia and the Middle East with the Islamic Empire. We have coins traveling all the way back and forth in between the two regions. So it's pretty neat. So we can see they were seafarers, warriors, and tradespeople as well. But they were also magnificent explorers. The Vikings themselves first sailed and discovered Iceland, set up a colony there. They went even further and set up a colony over in Greenland, and in fact made it all the way into North America, setting up a temporary settlement in modern-day Canada. Why is this important? Because it's actually occurred about 500 years before Christopher Columbus so-called discovered America. The Vikings had in fact been there first on a temporary basis. Now, going back to Europe itself, Europe proper, having to deal with constant invasions and worries about Muslims taking over Europe and Vikings stealing everything they had, the Europeans themselves began to centralize their position. What do I mean by that? Different and various lords throughout Europe would begin to come together and swear bonds of fealty to each other. Well, out of these various lords, one would usually rise to prominence. So many lords would swear him fealty, and we have the rise of counts, dukes, and even kings or queens in the area, where these kings and queens, dukes and counts as well, would have numerous lords serving under them. And these lords would then send them soldiers and eventually knights to help them protect against when the Vikings were attacking or the Muslims themselves were trying to push further into Europe. And so we see these centralized elements starting to form in these regions. Why is it important? Because these regions would essentially start becoming the kingdoms that we are more familiar with history. The kingdoms that made up Spain, the kingdoms that made up France, the kingdom of England itself. So it's quite interesting that we're starting to get the basic elements, and this was called vassalage, the idea of swearing fealty to a lord, basically loyalty to that individual, where he would supply you sometimes with land, sometimes with gold, and then you would supply him with soldiers and troops in times of battle and warfare. So the lord, or our point, the count or the duke, would send out a call to his land, and all of his lords would come together and send him troops. It's vassalage, and it formed the centralized basis of Europe seeking to protect itself from all these invading forces. So that's going to finish up our lecture for this week, and we'll go into a couple fun activities and actually a video on the Vikings that we'll see during class on Monday. So see you then, guys.